Thank you very much for being here. I'm not going to spend too much time introducing the panel, just to tell you that this is the panel that completes the presentation by the Secretary of State on security regarding Spanish position regarding FTFs stemming from our country, whether they be Spanish or not. And therefore we are going to try and approach what we do in this respect from the legal perspective, from the police perspective, and the penitentiary perspective. To this end, we have several civil workers, such as Mr. Miguel Ángel Carballo, Prosecutor, Ms. Cristina Andreu, Head of Analysis from the Antiterrorist Division, and Mr. Javier Lanza, Coordinator for Control and Monitoring Programs. Miguel Ángel Carballo will be the first to take the floor. He is a prosecutor. You all know him, so I'm not going to spend too much time explaining his CV. Since 2017, he's been coordinating international terrorism issues. Obviously, he also deals with international cooperation in the area of terrorism. So without further ado, you have the floor. Thank you very much, Fernando. First of all, I'd like to thank the Secretary of State for inviting me to this seminar, and of course, Real Instituto Elcano, and I'd like to encourage them to keep on studying this subject, because it's one of the major threats, not just for the West, but the rest of the world. A few weeks ago, we had the pleasure to receive a very top member of the American administration in order to approach these subjects, including some prosecutors. I'm going to try and be as brief as possible. Please don't worry, because this brick of documents I've brought here, these are just rulings and sentences which perhaps we'll be able to comment on regarding the subject of returnees and displaced to areas of conflict. The modification of the Spanish criminal code was extremely avant-garde, because even though articles that were modified after the reform in the area of terrorism didn't specifically mention the term jihadism, the reason for carrying out this reform entailed the fact that this was a reform that was meant to prepare our legislation to face this phenomenon that our country and other countries have been suffering from. And the challenges brought about by this terrorism and the threats are not very similar to what the situation was like in the past. So I believe these amendments are daring, and they're being followed in other countries. As regards individuals displaced to areas of conflict, and by the way, I'd like to say, well, as a Spaniard, I'd like to avoid English terms, because I've just come from a meeting on the financing and funding of terrorism. So I'm not going to be speaking about FTFs, and I'm going to be speaking about foreign terrorist fighters. Because now we speak about foreign fighters, and this sounds like some sort of rock band. And since 2010, then a new criminal code was introduced with imprisonment of up to 1 to 2 years that anticipated a criminal response to initial stages of criminal terrorist activities in this article. And unlike what we see in international instruments that haven't made much progress in this area, we included passive doctrines or training, and the self-training, that is people who on their own become involved in this violent jihadist radical activities, but always with the aim of empowering themselves in order to carry out any sort of terrorist attack. And I would also like to add what we used to call conflict areas displacement criminal actions. These people who became empowered or who decided to collaborate with a terrorist group or organization in order to commit any sort of a task would move to foreign territory controlled by a terrorist group or organization. This is why this crime was known as displacement to areas in conflict, and this sort of crime went through an amendment, and we excluded the last part. Right now we say moving to foreign territory in order to commit crime, in order to become empowered or trained or to collaborate with in terrorist activity. Just the mere fact of moving by with this intention already represents a crime. That is, we don't need to wait for that person to commit crime or to train anybody or to become integrated in a terrorist activity. It's enough to say that an individual has moved out of Spanish borders with this idea in mind, which is something very difficult to prove in many cases. The true thing is that the extension of this crime, because it doesn't state that this country abroad is controlled by a terrorist group, but this doesn't facilitate things, because the easiest thing until now was to prove that this person have moved to areas that were known as areas controlled or occupied by a terrorist group, and that was an objective piece of information that facilitated things. But now, if a person just travels to Germany with that goal in mind, that will, in this case, will have to justify what it is this person was doing in Germany, because it's not just moving to Germany as going to any other cities in Spain. So before the existence of this crime, the National Court was a pioneer as it comes to trying to anticipate to this. That is, a person whom we know was being followed by police forces, and they knew that this person had left Spain in order to become integrated in a terrorist group, and the idea was to be able to do something instead of waiting for that person to commit crime or become integrated in a terrorist organization, or even worse, having this person return to Spain in order to commit some sort of attack. So judges started issuing international detention arrest orders in the case of people that were under some sort of investigation, because there was a suspicion that this person had left our country in order to commit crimes. So this person could be neutralized, thus avoiding the possible attack I've brought a few sentences and rulings, but I won't be able to explain it all. We see that many of the returnees, there's a higher percentage of returnees who have become integrated, more this than merely moving abroad. In most cases, just like crediting the behavior of this person in our country and to prove what this person had done in the country he or she had done abroad, we've obtained more sentences based on integration more than displacement. In this area, where there's very little case law, and with a certain lack of certainty regarding the jurisprudence or case law in this area, we've got a whole range of types of crime. But it is true that all this range of crime or criminal activities is still in need of standardizing the doctrine of courts, because when there are different cases, we see different sentences or responses. One of the few areas that goes deeper into this doctrine is a sentence from January 16th in 2018, an individual who the Supreme Court confirmed this sentence, and this person was sentenced for collaboration with a terrorist organization, a 5-year prison sentence. But in this case, the Supreme Court says that this crime sees this as an action that could be preparatory of self-training or passive training or collaboration or an integration. That is, before we get to more serious crimes, the idea is to be able to punish this behavior. And here there is an exemption. That is, integration absorbs collaboration, and collaboration absorbs training or displacement. If somebody moves but is integrated, it's just integration. But if some person moves and collaborates, they commit a crime of collaboration. This is in the case where we cannot prove that this person has collaborated or has received training.
The Supreme Court says that you have to prove that he has gone there with the intention to cooperate with a terrorist organization. It specifies that it could happen, and this is also important, not only will it be considered the person that goes abroad, but the person who cannot achieve to get there because he does not try, or because he finally does not manage to get over there, regardless of his willingness. In this very specific case, the Supreme Court, despite sentencing this person for cooperation in its modality of indoctrination, because you know that the Penal Code, in the reform of the Penal Code, collaborate is to indoctrinate and to train, but more specifically indoctrinate. In this case, the Supreme Court excluded this crime because, and this is going to lead us to another issue, the issue of women displaced to conflict areas, because the intention of the accused was to get married with a member of ISIS. It says in the Supreme Court ruling that it does not only consist on supporting terrorist action. This is something which is in the media. Those women who have been displaced to conflict areas, what is the penal treatment that they should be subject to? I remember a professor of mine who told me, Jose Miguel Ángel, all this is very fine, but at the end it's all a matter of evidence. It all boils down to the evidence. So the problem with these women is an evidence problem. They have looked to what was her intention, what did she do, and what is her attitude in her return. And the Supreme Court says that just by the mere intention of going there to get married, even if it was an ISIS member, it was not in itself support to a terrorist action. Nowadays, this support, I don't know how to call it, sexually support or whatever, they are engaged in the aim of helping in the ISIS fight. But these are very fine-tuned nuances. And obviously, a sentence requires hard evidence. In this case, the Supreme Court said that in the evidence it was not included that she had started the displacement and that she had expressed that she would adopt the final decision. In some other sentences, it says they had in mind that they would do it someday, but they had not expressed it openly. But in this case, since it was a person which was indoctrinating others, they could say it could stimulate other people to do the same thing. So you can see the profile of this crime are rather complicated. Speaking about the women in conflict areas, because this is a rather controversial issue nowadays, and it is commonly spoken about, and the solution will depend on the evidence. For some time in our country, we have been witnessing male chauvinistic sentences where women could not be drug traffickers, women could not be embezzlers if they were the wife of a embezzler, and they were rather protective for women. Women were usually considered as victims, but sometimes they are, sometimes they aren't. Nowadays, it is true that in the investigations at the National High Court, we see it, and the police forces tell us that women are very good indoctrinators, especially for youngsters and minors. So these women may have gone there merely as spouses of a terrorist. They may have gone there to join a terrorist organization, but they may have gone there sharing that ideology, and their return to our country or to the countries of origin is a great problem. The problem of the return is very serious, not only because he or she can come back and indoctrinate, but because they are a trained indoctrinator. And when I say trained, I mean they can commit attacks. In the case of women, the National High Court establishes nowadays 70 international detention orders for men and 13 for women, 2 of which have returned. The problem linked to the women's case is a humanitarian case of minor children who are with them. In some cases, they're Spaniards. In some other cases, we don't know, because they may have been born abroad in the conflict area. At the same time, since it is a habit to have a second marriage, if a terrorist fighter dies, she marries another one, or a terrorist fighter may have more than one wife. So a wife can go to the area of conflict with 2 children and come back with 6. Many of them might not even be hers. And these minors, even if it seems surprising, they are already indoctrinated when they're 5, and they can indoctrinate other colleagues at school. So the problem is very serious, linked to a legal and judicial problem, and with a humanitarian problem of the minors, or the babies in some cases. That is why I'm saying what is pertinent and relevant in this case is to have enough evidence to be able to convict. In some cases has been easy, because the subjects who have been displaced have left a trace of their activity, both in Spain and abroad. And when they return, it will be easy to sentence and prosecute them because of the traces they have left in Spain. But in some other cases, we should know what they have done, where they have been displaced to. And here we have great difficulty. Obviously, there is a latent problem that we have studied with the military American army, which is the chem collection. This is a problem because there might be a fundamental piece of evidence, but we find that proceedings, guarantees may be problematic because the military are not judicial police. The legislation should change so that the military could be considered as a legal police. They should also acquire the knowledge and practice policemen protocols when it comes to collection of evidence, to be able to keep the chain of custody. And the problem is even greater when the military is not Spanish, so we have to use cooperation international instruments, with the difficulty on top of this that in many cases we're talking about battlefield situations where the collection of evidence prevents the evidence to be collected according to the protocols that I have just expressed. And we find ourselves that this displacement have a lot of funding. In some cases, the funding is not so much, they don't require so much money. It's microfunding, so to speak. With 300 euros in Spain, you do nothing, but 300 euros in conflict area is a lot of money. And they also have funders who are close to the borders or close to the conflict areas, and these people are key to channel the money and provide it to the fighters. I guess I'm going to leave it here, and I will be open to any of your questions. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Miguel Ángel, for such a detailed expose. Our second speaker is Commander Cristina Andreu, commander from Guardia Civil, who has long experience in the fight against terrorism, and she is currently the head of the Anti-Terrorist Division. Thank you, Fernando. Thank you to Instituto Elcano for having organized this forum against global terrorism. It is a great pleasure for me to have been invited and be able to contribute somewhat to what we are dealing here with. We have at CIMCO some knowledge, and maybe I can complement some of the things that have been said before, and previous speakers can complement what I will be saying. I will try to be brief because some of the things have already been said, so I will just try to complement some of the things that have been said. First, I would like to say that the phenomenon of foreign fighters is nothing new. We have had cases of Spaniards who have gone to previous conflict areas like Afghanistan, Mali, the Balkans, or Iraq, but it is true that the Syrian war, with the call on the part of terrorist groups so that people in other countries went there, has acquired a dimension that we had never faced before. We never thought that from our own country so many people could leave and go to work and participate with terrorist groups. After the self-proclamation of the caliphate in Syria in 2014, in June 2014, when al-Baghdadi proclaimed the caliphate, sorry about the technical problems here, the Secretary of State for Security appointed CITCO as a point of contact for everything that had to do with terrorist phenomena. That is why in CITCO we organized different working groups where, in principle, different institutions who were responsible for dealing with the terrorist phenomenon in Spain joined. As you know, in Spain, in terms of terrorism, we have the National Center for Intelligence, the two national police forces, police force and the Guardia Civil, but also the regional police forces, in the case of Catalonia, Mossos d'Esquadra, and Ertzaintza in the Basque Country. So at the time, Secretary of State decided that CITCO would be the entity responsible of receiving and updating all the foreign fighters, Spaniards lists, to be able to decide what was a threat coming from these individuals, these Spaniards, foreign fighters. We were charged of this task in 2015. We started registering. We have a list of them, where they are located, whether we believe they are dead, whether they have returned, and this list is shared with the other organizations which are responsible, the police forces. And then we also make a statistical number, talking about profiles, number of men, number of women, which is also given to other entities that are responsible with this subject. This updating is done periodically. We normally do a monthly information, and nowadays we have 248 people included in the list, Spanish list of foreign fighters, out of which 215 are men and 30 are women. I absolutely agree with what Carola Calvo said about the role of the women. And for us it is especially outstanding how many Western women decided at a point of time to displace themselves, in some cases with their families, in some other cases to get married with terrorists, so as to maintain this territorial control. As for statistics, you can see that currently in our consolidated list we have 248 people, out of which 133 are still displaced. So it means that we not only include people who are in Syria and Iraq, but we also include people who are in Mali, in Yemen, or in the Ivory Coast. It is also difficult to say how many people may have died, because we don't have absolute evidence of their death. But the information which is in the hands of the people responsible establish some presumed 68 dead people. About the returned, we are certain about some of them because they have been detained, and some of them are in prisons in Spain or in other countries, or they have been identified, but for other circumstances, like what the attorney Miguel Ángel Carballo said before, it is difficult to impose a sentence on them, so some of them are just at large. The gender, I already said, 218 men, 30 women, and the nationalities, you have it on the screen, 150 Moroccan, 48 Spaniards, and 50 of different nationalities. Regarding the nationality, it is difficult to determine which of these people correspond to Spanish authorities. For us, it is important to have proper international cooperation. As it has been said before, this is a phenomenon we cannot deal with by ourselves. We have to share information, we have to cooperate with other partners, and we have to adequate our legislation to the phenomena we're facing. The attorney has already said that the legal code in Spain was modified back in 2015. And it was a great success for us to be able to include as a criminal action the fact that an individual decides to go to a different country to become a terrorist. We adopted our different resolutions, 2138 and 2396, to adapt to this legislation. International cooperation is vital, and from CITCO we make sure that the people who are included in the consolidated list will also be registered in the different international databases, thus making easier to identify a person, maybe at a border, like in the Schengen information system, or the people in the list include whether they have an international order or the location. For instance, if a person is in Germany, someone who has identified the person can get in touch with an official in Spain to inform them. We also have the Europol system. This is not an operational database in itself, but they can provide information, and we can also exchange with another European partner data that will help us prepare a request for international detention order and complement our information. And we finally have the Interpol information system, the Interpol database. If there is an international detention order with a red request, or if there is no international order with a blue request, but all of this is included in this database, the 248, not the minors, because the minors cannot be included in the Interpol database, since in the 248 list we have adults, and we also have minors from 14 to 17, because below 14 they're not legally responsible, so they cannot be included. As the attorney of the National High Court said before, Something which is especially controversial is the situation of women and children in camps in Syria. The problem we are facing is that in many cases it is very difficult to identify them properly, and for this international cooperation is of utmost importance. We have to exchange our lists, we have to provide biometrics to make sure that the person is who he says or she says, and we have to identify the nationality of the people. In the Spanish list we have 248 people, but not all of them are Spaniards. In this case, the 248 people list, we include Spaniards and people who are legally residents in Spain. We do not include someone who has come to Spain and tells us he is here because they want to go to Turkey, to go from Turkey to Syria. This person would never be included in our list. We would include them if they are a Spaniard resident. Not all of them are Spanish, and not all of them can be repatriated to Spain. And I absolutely agree with what the Secretary of State for Security said this morning in her opening remarks. In the case of Spain, we have carried out analysis. We have made a case-by-case analysis of each and every person who are linked because they are a Spanish national or a similar link. Why? Because it is true that if in some cases these women, these minors, can go to a consulate in Spanish consulate, the Spaniards will have to take care of them, and if they're residents in Spain, if they have a different nationality, it won't be our responsibility. Right now we have 4 women who are located in 2 camps in the north of Syria. 2 of them are in the Al-Hol camp, and 2 of them are in the Al-Roh camp. They have 17 minors. 3 of them are Spaniards, but the 4th, despite her not being Spanish, she's Moroccan. She was married to a Spanish citizen, so her children are Spanish citizens because they get the nationality from the father. So she could ask to be repatriated by Spain because her children are Spanish citizens. And finally, to conclude, and we will have some more time during the Q&A session, I just wanted to say that from the Ministry of Home Affairs, because what we're dealing with is not only a responsibility of CITCO, the Ministry of Homeland, it is something that we have to do all together, because we have to be able to share the information not only among ourselves but also with our international partners. We consider that both men and women and minors constitute a threat to Spanish security. The male, not only because they know how to use the weapons and explosives, but also because they can also help radicalizing. And women also because they can radicalize and because of the violence that the children have been subject to. On the other hand, we know how difficult it is to have international detention orders, but if there are sufficient evidence, we consider that there should be issued for those who are in the Spanish list. For those who are not Spanish nationals, we're doing many things to make sure that they can be included in the Schengen list so that they won't come back to our country, not to our neighboring countries, because as it has been said here, it is very easy once they are in a European country to go to the other ones. So for us it is very important to ask for the nationality of those people who have two nationalities, and in the case of people who are in a country who are returned but they don't have any pending proceeding, to request the expulsion of these people. This is what we are promoting from the Ministry of Homeland to fight the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, and that is all I wanted to say. Thank you very much. Cristina, it has been a pleasure to listen to you. You have been very clarifying, and you have been very analytical. Finally, we're going to listen to Mr. Carlos Javier Lanza, who works as the Secretary General for Penitentiaries. I have to underline that he is program coordinator, control and follow-up programs within the penitentiary system. Carlos, you have the floor. Well, first I would like to thank Fernando for his very kind introduction. I would like to thank Instituto Elcano for allowing me to participate in this event, and for considering that the penitentiary institutions have something to say in this struggle, in this fight against FTFs. And I have to say that we currently have 12 people in prison who have been in conflict areas. It is a great honor for me to speak on behalf of the penitentiary institution. And finally, I want to acknowledge the work of all the personnel in the penitentiaries in this very difficult task that we have. I have prepared a small PowerPoint, but unfortunately I cannot say that the National Strategy Against Terrorism 2019 considers that FTFs who return are one of the great challenges that we have to face. They consider that the penitentiaries plays which is a good culture for the promotion of terrorism, and we're going to say what the penitentiary institutions do regarding violent terrorism. Back in 2004, Spain realized that they were far from terrorism. In 1985, there was already a terrorist attack in a restaurant where 18 people died. The penitentiary institution had to place more attention to this subject of terrorism, with a scarce presence within our walls, something that has increased. Currently, we have in our institution 104 interns who have been sentenced. With regards, we have this amount of inmates sentenced because of terrorist actions. In the penitentiary institutions, we decided to control more closely those inmates who have a sentence related to terrorism, which we included in a Group A. We also carried out a greater control on common inmates that we considered were being radicalized, and we also followed up in a center these kind of inmates, and the experimental protocol for the follow-up of these inmates was done because of 2004 legislation.
Because we're facing a new terrorist profile characterized by things like denying belonging to the organization or having been fooled and tricked. And secondly, this new type of terrorist lacks support organization. In the case of ETA, we knew that inmates in prisons received notes from other inmates, and they helped them and prevented them from speaking against the organization. As a third characteristic of this new type of terrorism is to sacrifice their lives in order to pursue their goals, in order to respond to messages sent by leaders who authorize them to commit terrorist attacks. And finally, these new terrorists believe that it's their duty to engage other terrorists in police operations, make us keep on working in order to reach our constitutional and legal goals. These operations have shown the existence of violent inmates in our prisons. And we can summarize this in the four following measures that I will be speaking of. First of all, early prevention measures, detection of radicalization, and FTFs are a very important focus of radicalization. Secondly, we offer them an individualized and voluntary treatment program. Third, we've come up with a tool in order to assess the risk of violent radicalization, and we're also collaborated in the execution, implementation of certain measures. First of all, as prevention and detection measures of radicalization in order to try and detect these attitudes, of course, abiding by the respect for human rights. We contemplate the following measures. Measures for preventing and detecting these attitudes. First of all, inmates are included in the special follow-up group, split into three groups. Group A, where we include those that have sentenced for crimes related to Islamic terrorism. In Group B, we include those inmates where we've observed a certain attitude putting pressure on other inmates. In Group C, we include those inmates where we've seen signs of radicalization. And right now we are following up to 165 inmates, out of which 140 belong to Group A, have been sentenced for crimes related to Islamic terrorism. In Group B, we have 49 accused of proselytism, and in Group C we have 76 that amount to 265 inmates that are being followed up, out of which nationality, in absolute terms, first of all, the most important nationality is Moroccan, with 118 inmates, out of which 50 some A, B, C, well, 118 Moroccans. But the most surprising thing is that the second nationality we find among these inmates is Spanish citizens. We have 65 Spanish inmates in Group A, 5 in B, and 16 in C. And this amounts to 88 Spanish inmates that are being followed up inside our prisons and who are linked to violent extremism. And as the gender split, we have 13 women in Group A and 252 males, out of whom 127 are terrorists. Have been sentenced, 49 belong to Group B and 76 in Group C. 13 women, 252 males under follow-up. So the first measure tending to detention is the inclusion in file and making a split into 3 groups, A, B, C, and also applying a restrictive scheme or regimen to those that have been sentenced because of their participation in terrorist acts. They applied a restrictive sort of procedure. But nevertheless, we have to say that in order to individualize treatments, there are cases where some of these terrorist inmates are in regular sorts of situation. As I said, treatment is individualized, so if there are some inmates that have been approved in order for them to move to another different sort of situation, whether this is done, and we go for a separation in cells in different prisons. And most of these terrorists are restricted, that is, they are in an area, a closed area. So we need to see how much vacancy or how much place exists, and we try to establish an equitable treatment from the point of view of adequate safety measures. We look for modern centers that have the necessary safety measures in place, so therefore we leave out this concentration, the concentration traditional model. We also apply safety measures included in the legislation. These jails or penitentiary centers can coordinate communication. They also control activities, attitudes, communications, money, that is the money of inmates, who gives them money, who they get in touch with, what are their families like. We want to know what their role is inside jails. We want to know everything in order to be able to make proper decisions based on maximum knowledge about the inmate. Fifth, we've banned collective praying, even though at the beginning we thought that there was a manifestation of freedom of religion since 2014. We considered that praying should be done in multi-use places adapted to this end, but not led by a charismatic leader, but by an authorized imam, in order to prevent the engagement of other elements, and also I must say we work in close coordination with the police forces. To this end, we have a special unit that provides advice, and with which we become coordinated in order to make decisions by collaborating closely. Please allow me to tell you something, because the first response was detention and prevention, and then offering treatment according to the goals set by penitentiary institutions and the strategies included in the document that was approved by the ministry. Penitentiary institutions are obliged to providing and facilitating those activities that will lead to the reintegration of these inmates. So in 2016 we set up a framework program for de-radicalization. 16 inmates have attended these programs. We mustn't forget that this treatment is voluntary. That is, they are offered this treatment, but we cannot make them participate in this disengagement program. And one of the difficulties we found is that most inmates deny being terrorists. They say, I don't need that program. And secondly, they start seeing it, and they start wondering whether that would lead them to admit their liability, their responsibility, and some contemplated in order to obtain penitentiary benefits or in order to somehow scale up the ladder of the penitentiary classification. So we have a series of professionals, and the program is carried out by prison psychologists who identify the risk psychosocial variables, and they try to gain their trust by means of a solid therapeutic alliance. And after this, they try and make sure that they would empathize with their victims and that they will be aware of the harm they've created, and trying to somehow channel their behavior. The idea is not to convince anybody about the need of a moderate sort of Islam. The idea is for them to understand that just because of their religious beliefs, they cannot murder, assassinate anybody. The program contemplates the aid and help provided by worship leaders. Since 2014, we considered that collective praying and worshipping should be led by authorized imams. And to this end, all the imams that are proposed must pass this security and safety filter, which makes it difficult to provide authorizations. But nevertheless, the spiritual support must be understood as positive spiritual support, because the goal is not to change their beliefs. The goal is not to make imams try or to treat inmates. The idea is to achieve the violent disengagement of those inmates. We must be open to including practices recommended on an international level, that is, using different alternatives, use of dynamics in order to mobilize emotions, the use of audiovisual materials. This must be assessed according to the therapeutic needs that are detected. And right now there's a task force of the Secretariat that studying the best way to adapt our program to the needs, to the present needs of inmates and the needs of those fighters that have returned. And please tell me that as a third response by a penitentiary institution, there's a risk assessment instrument that has been developed. Since 2018, a tool was set up for proselytes or terrorists or those who have shown signs of violent radicalism, and this must be assessed by different experts aided by technical teams on every 6 months. So different institutions must know about the existence of this tool prior to making decisions that affect them. They assess variables as the risk of inmates and the different needs. And I'm not going to go into this because I don't have enough time, but I'd like to tell you that the penitentiary institution collaborates in the implementation of some surveilled or supervised liberty. Consists on the use of telematic means. And finally, let me tell you that the present situation of FTFs in Spain is the following. 12 people are inmates in prisons, out of whom 2 are women, the rest are males, and all of them are in a closed system or regime, and 2 women are from Ceuta, Luxembourg, Denmark, Barcelona, all of them France. The profile of these women is that of the Mujahideen wife who comes to find her husband, but who wants to become integrated in the ranks of the organization. The profile of males is that of facilitating the sending of fighters they've been training, having returned to Europe and having been arrested. So the penitentiary institution wants to keep on making progress along the lines approved by the document approved by national security, by improving training of professionals. So to this end, the specific courses are being provided, reviewing the existing treatment program. There's a task force working on this and updating the tool for assessing the risk of violent radicalization. There's another task force working on the factors that affect radicalization and how to prevent it. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you very much, Carlos, for your presentation. That adds to the presentations provided by the other speakers. All three speakers have shown that Spain, apart from having a comprehensive strategy in place, has a sound set of measures and initiatives applicable to FTFs in different areas. Of course, the penitentiary is extremely important. It's clear that those 12 individuals that were FTFs have a potential role in the radicalization of individuals who are in prisons and who don't have a terrorist history, but who can act as a conveyors of these ideas and engaging others in these activities. So thank you very much, Carlos. I have a few questions. I'm going to ask them all together so that members of the panel will be able to answer them, and I will say who they are addressed to. In some cases, I'd like to simply take them to our area of concern, FTFs. For Attorney Carballo, when does the intention of moving abroad to become a terrorist, even though this doesn't take place, to what extent can this be penalized or sanctioned? When do you understand that this can be proven, even though that intention is proven, even though it never happened? Miguel Ángel, there's a question for you about what international law establishes in relation to the repatriation of FTFs, if it does establish anything at all. And for Attorney Carballo and for Cristina Andreu, there's a question saying, in the case of Spanish citizens who are detained in Syria, would it be illegal to prevent or ban their repatriation or return to Spain? And also for Cristina Andreu, there's a question. What happens in the case of individuals who have returned but who haven't been tried and sentenced? Are there any follow-up measures in place? Does their information remain in our information systems, in our files? Cristina, we see that out of the 248 FTFs, there are 50 from other nationalities, other than Moroccan or Spanish. What are we speaking of when we speak about these 50 individuals? And in the case of not allowing somebody to enjoy double nationality. What happens to those individuals who've become Spanish but who are of Moroccan background and who had to give up their Moroccan nationality, something which in practice is not possible? And there's another question, whether it would be advisable to assess the risk brought about by FTFs who are relocated in countries like Tunisia or Libya. There's another remark put by a participant in the forum. Don't you think that by preventing them from returning to Spain, those who are not Spanish citizens but have some sort of link with Spain, and wouldn't this represent a problem in the long term? For instance, knowing our country well, they will engage others to prepare terrorist attacks even when they are abroad or before returning. Very briefly, I'd like to say that thinking is not committing crime. After the doctrine said by the March 11 attacks, the Supreme Court demanded that apart from thinking of crime, this ideation must have some sort of action or externalization of a firm will to carry out an attack. And in the case of crime regarding moving to an area of conflict, it would be enough to justify this. Thus, the difficulty to prove this circumstance. If we move to material actions, things become easier because we obtain, for instance, if we seize a plane ticket, I'm not going to go into details, but a typical case is the behavior of an individual who left an area in conflict. Curiously enough, when he came back, he kept these activities of integration. He was condemned, but that was a prototype that followed the manuals of a displaced individual who was Moroccan, was living in a small village in Burgos, an individual who was completely isolated from a social standpoint. He was all day on his cell phone and his laptop. That is, all the contacts he maintained with other people were carried out through these devices, and all of a sudden he disappeared. So his boss at work called because he thought that something had happened to him. This person didn't have any economic means, but went to Santander and made a 4,000-kilometer trip in order to reach Gaziantep, which is a village on the border of Turkey, passing through Romania, Bulgaria. So this individual was expelled by Turkish authorities because a terrorist attack had been committed, so Turkish authorities started applying preventive and repressive actions, and they arrested any suspicious individual and sent them back to their countries of origin. This individual appeared in Barajas airport and with 20 euros in his pocket, looking suspicious, and he denied having come from that place and said that he was going on a tourist trip, but he was carrying a Quran with him. So we need to justify and prove that this person indeed has these ideas, and the only evidence or proof is that he or she has shared this ideation with others. We need to see what his surroundings are like, who he or she is in touch with. And it's not just that you say, well, I'm going to move and I'm going to join Daesh, because that would be a behavior, but it's very difficult to prove. But that is the behavior. That is somebody who moves to that area with that idea in mind, or before reaching his or her objective, to be detected and neutralized. But it's a very complex thing. It's you have to have an evidence on that. It's a person who doesn't just think like this, but who acts in a given manner. There's a sentence by the Supreme Court that ruled this out and said, we cannot prove that the accused had made the decision to go to Syria. That is, these people traveled to Morocco, and we know that one of them said this telephone will not work in Syria because they took a lot of clothes with them and they just had a one-way ticket, not a return ticket. This, together with the fact that they'd been in touch with a brother that was an FTF in Syria. The brother had indoctrinated him, and what we could prove was that they were already indoctrinated, but fearful because they didn't want to go, but they were delaying their departure, so they went to Morocco in order to see their families, and they only had an ultimate intention to travel to Syria. But so it's very difficult to decide where to draw the line and say what is crime and what isn't. It's a very complex situation, and there's a serious problem regarding evidence. International law, I don't know anything, any example, except for the issues related to human rights, to ideas for all countries to act jointly. In fact, I know that France was saying that detained in areas of conflict should be tried in those areas of conflict, but the serious problem has to do with minors. And about this subject, that is, can we prevent somebody from entering Spain? Here there's the absence of frontiers in Schengen. This is a serious problem because this requires a strict control of outside borders, because since we don't have any inside Schengen, anybody who enters this space cannot be easily controlled. What we can do is expel people, whether it be from an administrative standpoint, or to deny their entry, or but actually the difficulty is extreme in this case, and we understand, and these are the statistics handled by Cisco, is that we don't just arrest those people of Spanish nationality, but it was people who, prior to moving to these areas in conflict, had some relations with certain groups and who come back to Spain. People who may come crossing different borders, legally or illegally.
I'm going to try and answer all the questions that have been put forth. The first, whether it is legal to forbid nationals who are in Syrian camps to return to Spain. It's not illegal. There is like a vacuum, so to speak. There is no authority that we can go to because they are controlled by the Kurd militia, and there's no authority to deal with. If they were in Turkey, then maybe they could go to a Spanish consulate and request to come back to back. Then it would be totally acceptable, and we would probably make it easier for them to return. But the situation in Syria is the one it is, and there's no authority that we can deal with regarding those returned who have not been prosecuted and sentenced. And how do we follow up on these cases? Well, CITCO does not carry out any follow-up once people leave the prison. We just act as coordinators, so the measures that we carry out, the monitoring measures, are the ones that the police forces deem are the appropriate ones. So when the person has finished his sentence, then if there are any specific measures to go to court every fortnight, then the police force will be in charge of monitoring all this. As for nationalities which are not Moroccan or Spaniards in the list, we have all sorts of nationalities in the list. I don't know by heart the 50 people that are not Spanish or Moroccan nationals, where do they come from, but we have people from all over, from the Middle East, from different European countries, and also from the Americas. As for the question regarding freedom, we haven't done much about taking away the nationality of those people who have two different nationalities, because the civil code has to be adapted, but there is a possibility there, and we are assessing it. As for, I don't know if I understood the question properly, the risk assessment of FTFs who are located in Tunisia or Libya, I imagine you are referring to once the caliphate is over, whether they are relocated elsewhere. There are different options, not only Tunisia and Libya. I imagine these two because they're closer to Spain, but there are other possible scenarios like Afghanistan or Southeast Asia. Obviously, we're more concerned about the relocation of these individuals in Northern Africa. And as for the fact of forbidding the return of those who are not Spanish nationals, if this can be a problem in the long term, we at CITCO and at the Department of Homeland Security, we both agree that this is a threat to our country, but for us it is more risky if the person returns to Spain because they are trained in explosives and weapons and they have been subject to radicalization. So what we consider this is a threat. And if we believe this is a real threat, we prefer these people not to return to our country. And I believe I have answered all the questions. Well, in the case of Carlos, he doesn't want to add anything else because the person who will be closing this event is going to be the Secretary General of Penitentiary Institutions, to whom I thank for his generosity and for being so close to Royal Institute Elcano. We have a cooperation agreement with the Department of Penitentiary Institutions, so I invite Mr. Luis Ortiz to come up to the lectern but first of all would like to thank our previous speakers.